Hey guys, when you search for Bible-related stuff, virtually all the results are from Christian pastors and apologists.
Yeah, to find real biblical criticism, you need to dig down. Most people never even learn about all the scholarship out there, which debunks a lot of the evangelical claims.
Yeah, there's an entire well-funded industry of biased Christian content out there.
Our show tries to offer a counter-argument to them, but we rely on our listeners to keep the show going week after week. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project.
Thank you to all those supporting us. We hope you enjoy the show. I'm John.
And I'm Ben.
And this is the Skeptics Bible Project. We read the Bible
so you don't have to.
I don't care too much for preachers. I don't like to go to church. But I'd hate to meet St. Peter when my body leaves this earth.
Hey listeners, Ben here. So we had a little technical difficulties with John's microphone in this episode, so I just wanted to give you a little forewarning. Hope you still enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome back to the show. We're going to continue on with our discussion. I don't know, this is episode 77 of the Joe Rogan interview. I hope you guys like this deep dive, long format look into the interview. If you're ready, Ben, why don't we get started?
All right, let's go.
Because there's obviously something happening, particularly with us, if we really are related to homonadality, naledi. There's something clearly is happening. This is process of change. And if we don't completely understand all the factors in that process of change, we might miss out. The equation might be incomplete. I mean, we know a lot now about evolution that we did not know before. But like all sciences, new data comes in and you have to recalibrate things. Have you been paying attention to this? There's a new discussion about dark matter and dark energy.
No.
The new discussion is that it might not be a correct theory, and that what it might be is that time moves differently in the voids between galaxies. And this is a new theory. New enough and discussed enough among people that really understand it that it's getting to me, right? So I'm reading it.
Right.
So see if you can find that. It's a very complex and nuanced conversation, but most of the universe is dark energy, right? It's a giant percentage of the universe is dark energy and dark matter, and we don't really know what that stuff is. And so this is proposing that there's an additional possible theory that might explain it better.
I mean, that area of science is crazy.
Nuts.
Crazy.
And then you have the James Webb Telescope that's giving us even more data than ever before, and and you have to look at all of it and go, wait, why are those things here? How are they there so long ago? What are these red things at the beginning of time? What the fuck is all
The
this?
universe is bonkers.
Nuts.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we get that in history too, whereas we have these kind of what we think are established conventions, and then all of a sudden we discover something and it completely overthrows the ideas that we have. Actually, good segue. I made something for you.
Ooh.
I make papyri facsimiles.
So before he gives him the present, I don't know if you had anything to say on the tail end of that evolution discussion. Joe kind of let him off the hook by moving on into the dark matter discussion, and then kind of let him off the hook of that discussion as well.
It doesn't appear to me that Joe Rogan fully grasps the idea that Wes Huff completely denies evolution. He just doesn't believe in it at all. And Joe Rogan's going on the assumption that, we know more about evolution now, not realizing that Wes Huff just doesn't think that even happened at all. And then I also think when people get into the cosmology stuff and talking about dark matter and dark energy, which are two completely different things, they're distinct. I didn't know if Joe Rogan necessarily knew that. And they're just oh, it's crazy. Well, if it's that interesting to you, why don't you know anything about it? There's a lot you could read up on this. There's podcasts on it, there's articles and books and all kinds of things, but it doesn't sound like you really know anything about it, because Joe Rogan's just at the beginning of the universe, what's this read stuff out there. I kind of know what you're talking about. I think you're talking about redshift and what the James Webb telescope found in the earliest universe. It's more complex than what they would have expected, and scientists are trying to figure out. I've only read like 1 or 2 articles on that, and I know more about it than apparently Joe Rogan does. And obviously Wes Huff, who just kind of laughed it off like, no, I know nothing about any of this. And I just think, again, why are you asking Wes Huff about this, number one? Number two, if you're actually really curious about it, why don't you have real scientists that know what they're talking about on? That really will blow your mind if you actually hear what they're talking about. It's fascinating stuff. But he doesn't. Those are my thoughts.
I was thinking the same thing. If he wanted to know about dark matter, he could just simply have an expert on to talk about it. He wants to just do stream of consciousness. There's no point in having Wes Huff there, and Wes Huff doesn't know about any of this stuff. I do think it's interesting that he didn't really press Wes Huff on the evolution stuff. And that, again, Joe Rogan's version of the origins of the universe and the way evolution functions, I feel like, is sort of less than scientific level of knowledge. I think he has a popular level of knowledge about these things. So this whole thing is contributing to people knowing less about these subjects as opposed to knowing really anything. Even if he gets facts right, the implication of those facts are going to be lost in what Joe Rogan is doing.
So you were talking about, like, what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Ryland's 457. That's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. So that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly?
So I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
You did a great job, dude.
And
this is, you nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded out. This is a real nerding out of.
So that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
Where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, what is truth? So the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. And so he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis. So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and he incorporates this into history. And he says the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus, and so he says, based on this, John is the last written one, and it combines these two where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. Well, we discover this guy, C.H. Roberts, is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away, and he finds this guy, and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. There's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus, so it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript, which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the first century comfortably, and potentially even, like, most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
I have a lot to say about that. I think it's funny that Joe Rogan's just not interested in what Wes Huff wants to talk about. Which, it's weird because this is what Wes Huff claims to know about. Wes Huff doesn't know anything about dark matter and the cosmos and these other topics that Joe Rogan keeps coming back to. And so every single time Joe Rogan brings up something about totally off subject from the Bible, Wes Huff does everything he can do just to segue it back into apologetic claim. It's a very nuanced point that Wes Huff is trying to make. That's something that I don't even think the broader audience really cares about. It's only people that are really, maybe people that listen to this show, but people that are really engaged with New Testament studies. The dating of John is really what he's getting at. He's talking about John was probably written maybe 50 years earlier than what a lot of people have always thought John was written. Which to Wes Huff means that John was likely written by an actual eyewitness of Jesus. That's the whole point. He's trying to get at the reliability of the gospel. He's not saying that. He didn't say, hey, Joe, let me segue away from cosmology and dark matter and dark energy, and let's talk about why I think the Gospel of John is actual eyewitness testimony. But that's exactly what Wes Huff does. And Joe Rogan couldn't care less. He's just like, like, he has no idea what he's talking about. He has no interest in it whatsoever. And I don't think Joe Rogan even understands why that's an important detail. And then we could go in and actually argue with what Wes Huff is actually saying about the Gospel of John being very early. First of all, he just assumed without proving anything that the Gospel of John was actually written by someone named John that was the beloved disciple. I'm assuming that's what Wes Huff is teaching there. He didn't establish that at all. He just kind of claims it and we're just supposed to accept it and go along with it. And he also didn't say that, oh, by the way, almost all scholarship on this subject disagrees with me on this and thinks that John was written much later.
He gives him this gift, which, by the way, John's not watching the video, but it's a perfect replica of P52, so it's actually really pretty cool. And obviously we know that Joe Rogan is impressed by looking at the actual ancient text, right? And so this looks just like the real P52. So Joe is amazed and he's sort of like transfixed on that object. And then Wes can go into his whole discourse about why this text is important. First of all, he talks about Bauer and Bauer's assumptions about the Gospel of John being in the 2nd century, and he says that's based on Hegel, and Wes doesn't know anything about Hegel, so what he says is just idiotic. Fallacy that everybody who doesn't know about Hegel but has like heard about Hegel in a class says that Hegel says thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's just not even something that ever occurs in the work of Hegel. And that's definitely not how Bauer's assumptions were working. The reason that he thought John was later is because John has a more developed Christology. And when you compare the other 3 Gospels, they look extremely similar. We talked about this before, but you have Mark that's the earliest, and then you have Matthew and Luke that are sort of expansions on Mark, using some of the same material. And with each Gospel, they add layers of exaggeration or texture and the writer's own personal touches. And then you get to the Gospel of John, and it's this high rhetorical language, and the author and Jesus seem to speak with the same voice, and it's not about the kingdom of God being at hand at all anymore. Now it's about the spiritual communion between the Son and his Father, and how you can have communion with the Father through the Son.
There's lots more. You could talk about how it has a lot of more Greco-Roman influence on the philosophy that would have been definitely outside of Judea. But do you think Joe Rogan had any idea what he was even talking about?
No, I think this whole thing is lost on Joe Rogan, because what he really needs is someone like Bart Ehrman that's going to realize Joe Rogan knows nothing about anything, and we have to start at the most basic level. Joe Rogan claims to be going to church now, but he doesn't even know, like if Wes was to talk to us, we at least have the reference of the stories that he's talking about from growing up in the church. I mean, not like us, but like people that grew up in the church, like would at least know. But I don't think Joe Rogan even has that basic background knowledge. And this is all just apologetic parlor tricks. So anyway, he's wrong about Hegel. I just wanted to point that out. I don't think that's the assumptions that the early German critics were operating under. I do have problems with some of their assumptions. Then he gives the most generous date for P52, which is in the early 2nd century, which is probably more likely like in the very late 2nd century. It could be like in the anywhere from like the 160s to the 190s is probably more likely. And there's really, when you're analyzing writing style, it doesn't change that much over short periods of time. So it's really hard to tell within like less than like maybe 100 years sometimes.
And did you catch how he just slipped in that the author was John?
That's the next thing I was going to say. And then he goes from that to say, so now it's in the 1st century, and he's like, and furthermore, because John wrote it in Ephesus, it has to travel to get to Egypt. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, first of all, we don't know it was written in Ephesus. That's totally an assumption. We don't know that John wrote it. The beloved disciples, supposedly the author, according to the text, or at least the person who's, again, this is just basic stuff, but the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John is the one that's giving the testimony that is recorded by whoever is writing the Gospel. That's why there's this ending. None of this stuff is stuff that Wes is telling Joe Rogan.
Right. And none of it Joe Rogan wouldn't understand anyway, because it doesn't seem like he cares at all about this.
And then the final thing that Wes does is he makes another move where he says, no, this is actually the testimony of believers. Like, he uses his own assumption about John writing in Ephesus, like we know that, which it doesn't say that in the Gospel, and it traveling to probably Egypt. He just says probably, because that's where it ended up at Oxyrhynchus. So he uses two assumptions that he has to then push the date back even further. So his dating is wrong. It's too generous. It's probably not the early 2nd century. It's probably late 2nd century. Then he pushes the date up further by assuming a narrative that we don't know, namely that John wrote it in Ephesus and it had to travel to Egypt by the early 2nd century. And then he says that means it was written during the time of the disciples. And it reflects the testimony of the disciples. And it pushes all the other gospels further. So he uses it basically totally as this giant apologetic clusterfuck.
Yeah. I like how you put that. I think, though, that it's important to point out again, this is what we've been saying the whole time. That's not what a historian would do. Like you said it. He basically took whatever data he could find to spin the most possible sympathetic view toward Christianity that you could make. And that's not what a historian does. A historian takes all the data and then tries to lay out the most probable, the most likely scenario. What Wes Huff did was say, well, I could plausibly draw a path to an early date for the Gospel of John, which would make it more likely that it was written by the disciple John, an actual eyewitness of Jesus. That's what he did. And you can see at its core, he's a pastor, he's an apologist, he's not a historian.
Yeah, it's just so insane. Maybe because biblical studies is sort of a unique thing, as the biblical text is treated as a whole other thing because of Christianity and its influence on Western culture, but that's not a good argument for the assumptions that he's making. And yeah, like you said, to pretend that that's the view that most scholars have is just dishonest. That's not the view that most scholars have. And when you work for an apologetic organization, at a fundamental level, you can't be critical of that central dogma. And people like Mike Licona have shown that even if you're flexible on something like the dead raising in Matthew, you can lose your job.
It's kind of interesting if you throw out the scientific method or historical norms, the way that a historian approaches things, you really are being deceptive because you're saying, yeah, I know those things exist, but I'm not going to use them. Those things exist because it's the closest thing that humanity has to getting toward truth, right? So when you throw those aside in favor of things that back up what you already believe, what you've grown up believing in your church the whole time, and you're just going to constantly spin the evidence toward the thing that you already believe, it's a giant exercise in confirmation bias. It's not an exercise in getting closer to the truth. In a way, you could really make the case that apologetics is almost by nature deceptive because you're not giving people good information. You're giving people what you already believe despite what the better evidence shows you. If it so happened that the evidence really did bolster your dogmatic claims, then it would be different. But we all know that's just not the case. The evidence very often, if not almost always, doesn't back up the claims that apologists are making. The evidence that we have for the Gospel of John does not show that it was written very early in the first century. Almost all historians that have studied this have come to the conclusion it was written later, in the second century. And yeah, Wes Huff just made a case for it being in the first century without telling him, by the way, nobody that has any credibility agrees with me on this.
Or people might think it was written in the late 90s.
That's true. But not when Wes Huff is putting it. My ultimate point is that, and really this is a question for you, is the very endeavor of apologetics by nature deceptive?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. Because it's pretending to be, I mean, I guess they would just say, we just have different presuppositions than other people have, and everyone's entitled to, express their worldview. So we're not being dishonest. This is what we actually believe.
It's dishonest when he acts like he's a historian.
That's what I was going to say.
And then he gives data that historians disagree with. I think at the very least he should tell people, by the way, the people that have studied this stuff don't agree with me on this.
If you're a Christian that believes in honesty or thinks that you should be honest or think that it's wrong to lie, it seems like you should go on the show and just be ruthlessly critical, like ruthlessly honest about what scholarship really says, as opposed to trying to sugarcoat it to make yourself look good. If truth is truth, if Wes Huff was a real historian, he would say, this is what historians are saying. This is what biblical studies has thought. This is what the consensus is. This is where scholarship is moving. This is a complicated passage that there's a lot of disagreement about. But instead, there's really not that much disagreement about the dating of P52 being late 2nd century, as opposed to late 1st century. I don't think that there's anyone, maybe like Dan Wallace or something, thinks that it's that early. But I hear that repeated ad nauseum online now, because these type of claims get traction with dime store apologists. I think on the biggest podcast in America, and he's being framed as an expert, I definitely think that there's a sort of dishonesty when Wes doesn't address that. I mean, he probably thinks of himself as an expert, but he's never published a paper. He doesn't have a doctorate.
Seems like he's good at arts and crafts, though.
Yeah, so arts and crafts.
Well, he's there cutting and pasting, like making a replica of P-52.
P-52. Yeah, he's weird.
I get confused because there was a World War II fighter plane called, I think it's a P-51.
Because of my academic work in paratextual features, when we look at these tiny manuscripts and you figure out, okay, well, what does that look like on the page? I also made you. So this is, I used 2 different variations of papyri. Whoa. So you have there where P52 would have been on the page, and based on it's called codicological conventions, the spacings of the words, and the way that the size of the margin that we can see, where it would have been on the page and how big the page would have actually been. So this is like a reconstruction, and then I filled in the rest of the text in the same sort of stylistic hand of the scribes at that time, what that page would have looked like. So this would have come from what would have been essentially a pocket copy of the Gospel of John.
Wow. That's unbelievable. Wow. That's so fascinating.
So this is the kind of work that I do.
Maybe you want to have stuff to say about just that little bit.
No. I just think Joe Rogan is bored out of his mind.
But if you watch, he's pretty amazed. I think he's still thinking about the copy of Isaiah and how it relates to aliens.
I'm interested in the next point when Joe Rogan jumps in. We'll see. But I guarantee you he's not going to want him to continue on talking more about John and this.
So the funny thing is that Wes gives him this reconstruction of the Gospel of John that's based on his idea that the Gospel of John is in this smaller version that's like pocket size.
Right.
I don't understand. Does that seem like that math works out for you?
I was confused by that. Was he saying the original codicy was like that?
Yeah. All we have is a little piece that's like the size of a quarter.
Right.
I guess he can figure out, because it's written on both sides, that it comes from a codex, like a book, right?
Right.
But I don't know how you are able to understand the size of the pages of that book. There was like a standard size, and he says it's a pocket-sized version of John. I guess maybe he can tell somewhat the size because of the way the lettering on one side matches where the words are placed on the other side.
Do historians say what they think the size of the original one was?
I think maybe what he's saying makes sense, because maybe he has part of a line. Maybe they can, with the computer, recreate this line would have to fall here with letters this size in order for that other verse to match on the other side.
But don't they have examples of completed works, not the Gospel of John, but others in a similar style, where they can say, okay, typically they were done at this format and this size?
I'm not sure, because he says, and I think this is true, that Christians were the first ones to use codexes.
Right. So
that early in the 2nd century, maybe they weren't really a popular way
So there's just not a lot of other examples.
for Greco-Roman literature to be distributed that way. They would just use scrolls like they would always use. Because reading was also done publicly back then. So I don't know. I think that there may be some validity, but I just think that it's interesting that he's recreating a page. He's like doing a reconstruction, and then based on that reconstruction, also claiming to have reconstructed how big the size of the gospel would be. Like pocket size or whatever. And then I just started thinking about, you know how in the Clint Eastwood movie Unforgiven, they have those pocket. That guy writes those little like pulp novels. Like that's almost how I imagine the gospel starting out. As sort of, there are these stories about this Jesus of Nazareth, and it was popular to have all these various popular stories were going around, and so these authors tried to kind of make popular versions of that story for publication. And that's what we ended up with through happenstance to be the Gospels that are in our Bible.
Yeah. I don't know if it's relevant to the discussion now necessarily, but it's a fascinating thing to dig into. It's also something that you don't really hear people talking about much. What was the actual purpose of the Gospels when they were first written? Why were they written? Who were they written to? Because if you grew up in the church like us, you just assume that, well, the earliest followers of Jesus wanted to document everything that happened. And that's how we ended up with these Gospels. But like you said, there's probably a lot more to it than that.
There's always this huge reluctance for people in the mainstream church may not even ever really talk about these type of historical issues that come up with historians, but some do now because it's become more popular in the mainstream. There's always a reluctance to talk about the authors of the Gospels outside of this traditional view that even if you're skeptical that they were the figures that tradition holds, that they aren't transmitting some sort of sacred tradition that was passed on from Peter or whatever it is, as opposed to thinking what we really have is a reception history for these documents that's much later than that. We know from the documents themselves that there are more Gospels that are going around early, and we have a reception history later that has said these are the Gospels that we think are authentic, and then they stamped them with an authenticity of tradition, and then that became the framing and the prism that everything else has been viewed as, whether it's orthodox or heretical, or it's all so circular and problematic.
Yeah.
Figure out, okay, you have these fragments. How big would have this codex actually been? How big would have the document been? And then you compare and you contrast them to, say, like non-Christian literature, like Thucydides or Tacitus or Pliny or Cicero or Cassiodeo, those kind of guys, and look at the differences between how these documents would have been put together and written in their day.
God, it's so beautiful. It's just so bizarre to imagine these people writing this stuff down so long ago.
You know what's wild is when you actually get the chance, which I have a number of times to actually handle the original documents.
Oh my God, you wear rubber gloves?
No, you know why? Is that we used to do that, but actually the oils in your hands are more abrasive than latex or even cloth. No, sorry, I said that wrong. They're less abrasive. Okay. So it used to be that you always had to handle things with, gloves, and nowadays we don't do that anymore.
Ooh, that's wild. And you're touching it with your actual fingers. That's gotta feel bizarre.
I was at the 2 summers ago. I was at the University of Pennsylvania, And I was looking at a manuscript called P1 or P-Oxy 2, 1.2. And it's a beginning of the 3rd century copy of the first page of Matthew's Gospel. And when I requested access to it, they told me that the last person to request it was when Pope John Paul II came and visited the States, and they pulled it out for him. Wow. So on the, in the library when you used to have to punch your name, write your name on the cards.
Yeah. If
there was a card, so I made a facsimile of that one too. And that one is that's the genealogy of Jesus from Matthew's Gospel.
Wow.
Actually, you know what, Jamie? If you go up to the search bar and put CSNTM, those letters, CSNTM.org.
I just am kind of laughing about Joe Rogan every time he says anything, because he's like, I just can't imagine. It's so amazing, like these guys actually writing something. Why is this so crazy? I don't understand what's crazy. It's like people writing stuff. I don't get what he's so amazed by.
He needs a real historian to come in. I'm just trying to imagine what Joe Rogan is imagining in his mind when this text is being written and conditions that it's being produced under and how it relates to the other texts that they talked about, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Because in Joe Rogan's mind, maybe all these texts are contemporaneous, but that's just not the case.
There's a lot of assumptions that Joe Rogan and the audience understand the context of what he's talking about, and they really don't. Joe definitely doesn't.
And if you're going on a show and your whole thing is, I'm going to debunk the conspiracy stuff that this guy said about religion, which is how he got on because of the debate with whatever the guy's name is. This is just muddling and confusing, and it's not doing Joe Rogan any good or even helping him understand. His comment showed, but maybe that's the point. That's the whole thing. Maybe the whole point is to wow Joe Rogan, so he's not really even thinking about what Wes is saying. He's just impressed with the presentation.
I guess so. It seems to me like Wes Huff spends a long time thinking about how he can package his apologetics to a wider audience, and now he's on the biggest show in the world, and this is his chance. So he's pulling out all the stops for all the things that he's been talking about for so long, and without any pushback whatsoever or any recognition that he's not really the type of person that you should be talking to when you actually want real historical information.
I don't know how in the world you can have enough time to create replicas of these texts and also all those infographics. That must be like
I said, arts and crafts.
Yeah. It's apt and funny.
So they go around the world and they try to digitize all the existing New Testament manuscripts to preserve them. And so you can actually, you see there on the side, you can click, I want to look at a papyri, and you can go the different conventions of, the date or the time.
And so you could read the translation and then go and look at the original source of it.
Yeah, so ideally you always want to go look at the original, but because of organizations like CSNTM, which is actually in Dallas, you people like me don't have to go to Europe where a lot of these manuscripts are housed. We can look at them, and because these are such high grade, that you can figure these things out. A guy I know, Elijah Hickson, he used that, and he actually figured out that there was a prominent manuscript, P50, which is a forgery. And so he used that based on looking at the digital.
Really?
Yeah, he filled in the gaps within the rips and saw that the words didn't match up when you fill in the gaps. And so when he's transcribing the text, he's like, wait a minute, I don't think that word fits in there. And based on that, he's like, yeah, that's a forgery, because someone has written the text in after that piece of papyri, which is, these forgeries are almost always a genuine piece of ancient papyri. Someone gets it from the black market antiquities.
Oh, and then just writes on it afterwards.
Yeah, right there. So P50. So if you fill in these holes, they're called lacunas. the words, a lot of the words don't fit. So someone's come along and they've like done a really good job because it fooled scholars. And they've written in the text, but not quite good enough to figure out that not all of the words fit in the gaps that you presented.
Didn't J.R.R. Tolkien, didn't he create an entire language for Lord of the Rings?
So a lot of the languages, because he was a linguist,
Yeah.
a lot of the languages are based on existing languages.
Okay, so he just combine them together to form his own version of it?
Yeah, like Elvish and Dwarvish, and
Yeah.
like they're all based on like ancient Norse or Old English, or so he would like take like those languages, and if there's anyone who's the best at world building,
Right.
like you can learn Elvish
It's a real language.
because he developed the
Yeah,
language.
That's so crazy.
That is crazy.
That is so the dedication. That's so bananas.
I mean, he was a genius. Guys like him
Yes.
and even Lewis, they were friends.
Really?
C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Really?
Yeah. Tolkien played a big part in Lewis's conversion because Tolkien was Catholic, and I think Lewis was Irish, and so he couldn't quite become a Catholic, but he became a Protestant Anglican. But yeah, they were the Inkling Society. They would meet in Oxford.
Those UK pubs that's been around for 1,000 years.
Yeah, right. They would meet and talk. They were called the Inkling Society.
Wow.
Yeah. What is Eagle and Child? Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it's funny when you read how Tolkien really didn't like Lewis's stuff because he said it was way too like straightforward. He's like, you got a Jesus lion? Good one. Like you're not beating around the bush on anything when you got a literal Jesus who's sacrificed. Come on, rises from the dead. What are you doing here?
That's
So yeah, but
that
they were
would be an
friends.
interesting conversation to be a fly on the wall.
Yeah,
Tolkien breaking down Lewis's.
yeah.
That would be fascinating.
Apparently, the guy who wrote Dune sent a copy to Tolkien before he published it,
Really?
and Tolkien didn't like it.
Wow.
He sent it back and said, like, I got nothing good to say, so I'm going to say nothing at all.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. Well, he was wrong. Even geniuses. Well, I mean, some geniuses are just like so in their own head.
Different strokes.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem. I mean, but it's also what makes them so great in the first place, that they have this like singular vision and dedication, so much so that they're writing an Elvish language and combining words for it.
Yeah.
Jamie, did you find that thing about the dark matter?
Told you. He's right back to the dark matter. It's hilarious. I'm sure, like, as soon as you said that, Wes Huff was like, oh no. Dark matter, here we go.
I thought I got him off the dark matter, but we're right back.
I don't care about the Lewis and Tolkien stuff. In the church that I grew up in, there was so many C.S. Lewis fanboys, and they were like into it and talking about that kind of stuff. They would like sit around drinking scotch and smoking pipes because they were basically cosplaying that time period in history. And so I've always had this aversion to it. I mean, they're both great writers, especially in my opinion, Tolkien. It's just not something that I really care. I'm just like bored out of my mind when people start going on about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and their conversations. If you're into it, great. It's something I'm just not interested in.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of boring. It's become sort of Christian nationalist coded. I do give some credit to Tolkien. He was very brave in World War I. Some people would say he's a cunning linguist. Some people would say he's a cunning linguist.
I'm not a good sidekick, Ben.
I know.
I'm not like Andy Richter. Or even, who's the one on Johnny Carson? Ed McMahon. Yes, sir.
Aha! Cunning linguist.
You are correct, sir. Hear the joke, and then I'm like, I'm not going to laugh. Like, I'm not going to back you up with a laugh. That's not my job.
Well, it was crazy because Lewis was known for his diatribes back and forth with Tolkien. So you could say it was a cunning linguist going up against a master debater.
Ha ha!
Ooh-ah! Hee-ah!
You are correct, sir. Ha ha, master debater. I got it. It's a good one.
The whole thing is kind of boring and nerdy. And I honestly don't think Joe Rogan knows that much about C.S. Lewis.
I was surprised he knew who he was at all, but
maybe he saw one of the versions of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I find that most people's knowledge of Lewis falls off tremendously after that, except for, like you said, like the weird people that still cosplay and people that are obsessed with him as a philosopher where he was never really very good.
I read actually a lot of Lewis just because in church they used to really push it on everyone. As a kid, we read all the, Narnia Chronicles, and then I read later Mere Christianity, and then I've read some of the Screwtape letters. So actually I've read a lot of C.S. Lewis, and I actually agree with Tolkien that I think he's not that great. Like the Narnia Chronicles, sorry if you're fans of it out there, I don't think it's that great. I think Tolkien's right with what he said. Yeah, there's a Jesus lion. It's so obvious. The allegory is so in your face that it's a little bit like, I get it, okay. But I think it's Father Christmas is in it. What's going on here? This is just not good. I just don't think it's good.
I don't object to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I definitely read that book, and I read Prince Caspian and some of Voyage of the Dawn Treader when I was a kid, but I don't think I read any of the other books in the Narnia series.
The Silver Chair and
The Horse and His Boy.
Yeah.
The Last Battle. The Apprentice Nephew or something. Or
should have just ended it after The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
I mean, once they went on the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, I don't even know if I finished that book, but whatever. I'm not here to judge C.S. Lewis. If you like him, I don't judge people's taste.
And by the way, C.S. Lewis would not be accepted by modern Christians at all with his theology. He was not a young earth creationist, for instance. I could make a list of things that he believed that Orthodox conservative Christians in our modern day would have big problems with.
And I think that he has some weird sexual stuff. He was into disciplinary stuff or something weird. Anyway, I'm not here to litigate the life of C.S. Lewis. If you enjoy those books, that's fine. Lord of the Rings has been sort of fascist, neo-Nazi, MAGA coded lately, which I think is annoying. And every year there's some college professor writes something about how Lord of the Rings is racist or the orcs represent people of color. And then the whole right wing goes crazy, and it just happened a few weeks ago. And so I just find the whole thing exhausting.
Just because I brought it up, I just did a quick search. Here's just a couple. And again, I'm saying this because I know Christians that almost worship C.S. Lewis. They think of him as one of the greatest thinkers, one of the best Christians, a model for what a Christian should be. Here are some of the viewpoints that he has that modern Christians I don't think would totally be okay with. He believed parts of the Bible, like Psalms or Genesis, contain myth or error and shouldn't always be read literally. He accepted theistic evolution. He suggested that hell might be self-chosen exile rather than eternal torture. He believed non-Christians might be saved through Christ unknowingly. He believed in salvation outside of Christianity. He rejected strict penal substitution, saw the cross more as moral influence and victory over evil. He was sympathetic to purgatory, like on Catholic elements, and prayers for the dead. He portrayed hierarchical but complex male-female dynamics, sometimes criticized as inconsistent or dated. He argued that Christianity was myth. He called it true myth, and not strict literalism. Poetic yet real. That I could get behind more. If Christians argued that stuff now, it would make more sense to me, because when science or history tells us something about the Bible that we can say, well, okay, this shouldn't be taken literally. They can hold to a view of Christianity by saying, yeah, it's a form of poetry where there's truth in it. I'm more sympathetic to that type of view than what you hear from most fundamentalists. He also thought animals might share in the resurrection of eternal life. which is interesting and weird. And he expressed some hints of universalism. I think we did an episode on universalism, but the idea that salvation could reach everybody. So anyway, those are just a few bullet-pointed lists, but so when Christians talk about C.S. Lewis and how wonderful he is, we can bring these things up and ask them what they think about it, and most of them will say, no, that's heretical, you can't even be a Christian and believe those things.
And I also just think C.S. Lewis speaks to this sort of pathological need that Christians feel to be embraced as intellectually...
Yeah, that's a good point.
To be taken seriously intellectually. Like, we're not just idiots.
You're exactly right. That's why they love it. That's why they break out the pipe.
Even amongst the more radical fringes of conservative evangelicalism, that's like, we're not seeking approval from the world. You have to stand up against it. There's still a sort of unacknowledged... They want to be taken seriously intellectually. They just think that their presuppositional philosophy is actually the serious philosophy. It's just a weird underlying thing. Like, we need some sort of a hero to be able to say, look, C.S. Lewis was a really smart guy. J.R.R. Tolkien was a really smart guy. They were both Christians. You like Lord of the Rings, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, J.R.R. Tolkien was not a Christian writer. He was a fiction fantasy writer that happened to be a Christian, just like almost everyone of his culture was a Christian. A lot of Christians will try to claim Tolkien as this Christian author. He actually specifically said, no, these books are not Christian allegory or anything like that.
He never had a Jesus lion, that's for sure.
Or Santa Claus. Sorry, Father Christmas, wearing like a red suit with a white beard. I think that's how he's depicted. Mere Christianity, I think modern apologetics, they love C.S. Lewis so much. He gives them seemingly good philosophical arguments that when you hear for the first time are very compelling, very convincing. You know, I could see why someone like Wes Huff would really like C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis was doing that kind of exact thing. Of course, the logic of it from real modern-day philosophers will say, oh, this doesn't make any sense at all, and it's really mostly been debunked. It is interesting, though. The liar, lunatic, and Lord is the famous C.S. Lewis paradigm that I think we've discussed. Have we talked about that on this show?
We've probably alluded to it, but I don't know if we've specifically talked about it.
I don't know if now is the time to really get into it, but it's a famous paradigm. C.S. Lewis basically saying, like, the reason I believe that Jesus must have been the Lord, and I guess he means Son of God, is because based on the things he said, he was either a liar or a lunatic, and the only other option is that he was the Lord. He really is who he said he was. Of course, what he's leaving out is another L, which is the legend, which is actually what most scholarship now says. The stuff written about him, we have no idea Jesus actually said it, and in fact, we think it's really likely that he didn't say a lot of that stuff. So, anyway, we can get into that probably in another episode. It's pretty far afield from this, but it is interesting.
Either way, Joe Rogan probably doesn't know who C.S. Lewis is. He's just pretending. The other thing is C.S. Lewis, the movies keep failing. They're not good. For whatever reason, they can't get it to work. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is the one book that I think actually does kind of work as a story. It's just weird. I think it's never really been done well. PBS did a good version a long time ago.
I mean, I think again, I feel like I'm annoying the audience by talking too much about this, but hey, whatever. I think the story works until they go into Narnia. I think the mystery about the wardrobe is kind of cool, and then maybe coming in and out, but going into Narnia, it just kind of loses me. Because it does. It becomes too obvious and too blatant. It's like Pilgrim's Progress. If you are all familiar with that, it's the same type of thing. Pilgrim's Progress, there's a character named Christian, and he has a burden on his back, and he has to go to the cross to release the burden. It's just so blatantly obvious what. And to me, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a similar version of that. People probably are hating me because, like, people might love those stories, and I'm just saying I don't find them that compelling.
I think people recognize they're sort of problematic. I went to a evangelical Christian college. In my philosophy classes, they didn't really treat C.S. Lewis that seriously. And when I took philosophy of religion, they didn't really take his arguments that seriously either. So he's smart and he writes well, but his ideas are not really taken that seriously. And the Liar, Lunatic Lord, like John said, has some serious problems. I remember, though, one time in an English class, the professor asked, what's the most famous Christian allegory in history? And I said, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I thought I was smart. And he was like, no, Pilgrim's Progress. So.
Yeah, Pilgrim's Progress probably beats it out, but I don't know. I mean, everything I'm saying comes from, like, my experience in the church, and both of those things were really pushed on the kids.
Yeah, I think Pilgrim's Progress, more like a strict analogy. Like you said, the person's name is Christian. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe definitely has, Aslan is definitely Jesus, but it's also not really easy to interpret what everything else is supposed to stand for in that story, but yeah.
You were saying, I think in the previous episode, about how the Bible stories themselves are written like that, where the characters' names mean something. Like, I think, doesn't Adam mean man or something?
What combined Earthling, basically. It's the man made of earth.
Right.
Which is exactly what he is in the story. The same word for snake also means crafty, and then the snake is crafty. Or cunning in the story, or whatever. And all through Genesis, that happens in different stories.
Maybe C.S. Lewis wrote Genesis.
It could be.
Or John Bunyan.
I mean, we know Genesis is probably later than Moses.
John Bunyan, by the way, is the author of Pilgrim's Progress.
I like the illustrated version of Pilgrim's Progress. I think it's Dangerous Journey.
Yeah, I was into that too. Actually, the illustrations are great. It was really well done.
I still endorse that, even though it's religious propaganda. I still think the artwork is pretty cool in that book today.
It started saying that it was almost like they started off with a theory, and that's how they do things, and then they start working through the theory until someone has a better theory.
There's such a giant problem today in that if you just post some fantastical claim in a headline, like that the theory of dark matter has been debunked, and then you get clicks.
Yeah.
And so you can kind of get away with doing that now.
It's just hilarious that Joe Rogan's going back to this dark matter thing. I don't know why I find it so funny, because I just feel like Wes Huff is like, does not care at all. And he's like, what am I doing on here? So Joe Rogan keeps bringing this up, and then Wes Huff, watch, is going to steer it again back into his apologetic points that he just keeps coming back to over and over.
Also, something that keeps happening in the show is Joe Rogan keeps like making claims that when they look them up online, the claims are not true.
Right. He has a real problem with that. I mean,
He's like, it's such a problem, man. Like, people will put a headline up, and I'm stupid. I just read the headline. Next thing you know, I'm blasting that out to everyone in the world. And then I look at it, it's like, oh, dark matter hasn't been disproven.
He has a real problem with that. Like, there's many examples where he does that. And he's been caught many times on air where people are correcting him.
Yeah, I think it's about to happen here.
So dark energy is a problem. Modern cosmology, as most problems in science, you start with a model, you go out and make measurements, you find your measurements don't fit your model. This is a problem. When this happens, scientists go off and try to come up with new theories. I think that meant no models. I think they meant new models. New models which do fit the new data. In the case of things like dark energy, we get hundreds, if not thousands, of new theories. ACDM is the current best model of cosmology. The CDM stands for cold dark matter. It's a model that includes certain theories to explain dark matter, and the lambda A is a cosmological constant.
That's the Greek word lambda, or the Greek letter.
Yeah. Which is used to model dark energy. Note this mathematical model doesn't explain what dark matter or dark energy are. It just incorporates them to make the maths work. So this is a long, I don't know if this is exactly what they were saying about, it was like a much more of a synopsis, but what they were saying was that it might be that time moves differently in between.
I can't believe this guy has a show. It's literally like your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving just kind of spitballing stuff that he saw a headline online about and has no idea what he's talking about, and then just picking up his phone and randomly scrolling to find, like, there's no journalistic integrity at all. I can't believe he has a show. I can't believe this show is that popular. People listen to this.
You were talking earlier about hearing right-wing talk radio when you were a kid. But even then, there was some institutional breaks. This is just, Joe Rogan is totally doing this podcast himself. So he can totally control the content. And he just makes claims. And there's other people that do this too, like Tim Pool. They make claims from headlines that they see on social media. And then sometimes it's corrected, sometimes it's not correct. They happen to check this out, and they can't even find what he's talking about.
Headlines in papers that are designed for popular audiences about science news are notorious for having misleading headlines. When you really read the academic papers, are almost never is saying the thing that the headline is hinting at. It's almost never aliens. Might be like the least probable explanation for this is the thing that it says in the headline, because they know it gets people to click on it and read it and makes them more money. So if you're just reading the headlines, you're going to have a really bad perception of what science is actually saying on these topics.
Is Wes an idiot? He doesn't know the gaps theory? This would just be the gap. We don't know how dark matter works. Therefore, just because we don't know something doesn't mean you assume a whole nother set of assumptions. Whatever Joe Rogan read, who knows what the problem in the model that we have. But I don't know what he was talking about. Some intergalactic moving dark matter.
It was kind of like a word salad. I was trying to follow it also, and I couldn't.
I think it was something like what Brett Weinstein described when he was on the show, which was nonsense.
I don't regularly listen to Joe Rogan, so I did not hear that.
I just happened to see that clip as well.
No, I know you're a big fan.
I just like MMA, so I listened for the MMA commentary. Which is funny if you know me, because I really don't like MMA.
Galaxies. See if you could Google that.
Physics and cosmology are just wild.
Well, it's so insane because we're so separate from it because of light pollution that the most majestic thing that you could ever see, we gave up so that we could drive at night. It's really weird because when you go to a place, I've talked about it a bunch of times, but I'll say it again. I went to the Keck Observatory many years ago, and we got there on a perfect time where the moon was not out at all, and the sky was insane. It was like you were in the cockpit of a spaceship, and it was just like you were in a giant glass cockpit, which is essentially, we are kind of in an organic spaceship hurling through the universe, so it should look like that. But it just doesn't, because of the fact that we're constantly inundated by light pollution.
Yeah.
And I think the ancient societies and ancient cultures didn't have that. And because they didn't have that, I think they had a much more humble view of our place in the universe. Because you're just presented with something that's absolutely impossible to imagine.
We definitely lose our sense of awe.
Yeah.
When we can't see kind of ourselves
Right.
in the grand scheme of the universe.
Yeah.
And you're right. When you go somewhere where there's no light pollution, you look up at the sky, it's like, even not at somewhere like the Keck Observatory, where you
Right.
can like get a crazy view of it.
Yeah.
When you just go out in the country and look
Yeah.
up and you're like,
That's the Milky Way. You can see the Milky Way. Dark energy debunked by lumpy universe expansion.
It's just funny to me. Also, it should be understood the ancients did not understand the correct view of the universe. They did not realize that we were on a global sphere revolving around the sun, and those other objects, those stars out there were other suns. They just did not realize that. Most cultures actually would personify the stars as beings, sort of gods of some sort. And I'm not disparaging them, but they weren't looking at the universe being humble. We're on this little dot in this vast expanse of other planets and solar systems. They did not understand it that way, if that's what Rogan was getting at.
I don't think Wes and Joe were talking about the same thing, though. I feel like there was some disconnect, like Joe Rogan is talking about some weird quasi-spiritual disturbance in our essential being because we decided to drive at night. Now we're detached from our elemental nature. I don't know, maybe I'm putting words in his mouth. And then Wes is just like, yeah, I mean, it is nice to look at the sky and see the stars. But you're right. And I think like even like the cultures that were able to predict events like the comets and the constellations and were able to map that had a faulty cosmology that was able to make sense of the data. So it just shows you they used what they had at the time to try to make sense at the time.
And some of them did have a better understanding than what I said.
But you can think that there's a giant circular expand that's sort of rotating above a flat plane, and that's why you keep seeing like at certain times the same beings passing over. And that's wrong. That's just wrong on so many levels. We're on a globe that's floating in its own path around other like terrestrial objects. But if you're just looking on the ground, it's how you're making sense of the data that you have. And then some people are just like, that's a god, that shiny thing.
Now the existence of dark energy is being challenged due to new evidence that the expanding universe is actually lumpy. So what they mean by lumpy is this: where they're talking about how time moves differently. See if it has a synopsis of
It's
it.
like each article I found gets into explaining what dark energy is, and then
Gets into the weeds.
there's probably a paragraph at the bottom that says what you're looking for.
What is a timescape model? This is it. So timescape model rejects the idea that dark energy is the driving force of universe expansion. Improved analysis of type LA supernovae has suggested that the acceleration based on light curves seen in 1998 was a case of misidentification. The timescape model amends this by considering differences of time in void and matter-dense areas. The model suggests that time moves much slower in matter-dense areas, like the Milky Way galaxies, than in voids. With more time passing in voids, increased expansion takes place, making it seem like expansion is accelerating as the voids increasingly spread through the universe. Dark energy, therefore, is not needed to explain the expansion of the universe, according to the researchers. Who fucking knows? It's too much. It's too much. Like, what are you even saying? How crazy is this? You know, like, one of the more controversial aspects of the James Webb Telescope was this theory that perhaps the universe was quite a bit older than 13 point, whatever billion years.
Right.
And they were trying to push it back to 22 based on the existence of galaxies. But, like, and people are pushing back against that, and there's a lot of debate about that. But the bottom line is all of it is too many numbers for your brain to even register.
Yeah.
That, you know, however many billions of years ago, there was nothing.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden there was something. And Terence McKenna had a great line that said that science requires one miracle. The Big Bang. It requires a miracle.
Well, I always say that when people ask me about, you know, the miracles in the Bible. Yeah. And I say, well, you know, if the first miracle happened, if everything, you know, nothing became everything, then, you know, Jesus turning water into wine.
That's an easy one.
Well, yeah.
That's a party trick.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is nothing compared to the birth of the universe, but we're convinced at the creation of the universe, and we're very skeptical at other miracles. It's very odd.
Again, it's like God of the gaps, where I don't feel comfortable calling it a miracle, but at the same time, I think it is one of the greatest mysteries that science has yet to answer. But I don't feel comfortable with just pouring God into that gap and saying, well, then let's just assume it was this all-powerful being, because like Carl Sagan says, well, you still have the problem of, well, who created God? What about that miracle? Or did God always exist too? Oh, okay, well then things can always exist. Maybe the universe always existed. I certainly don't have the answers to where everything began, or if there is such a thing as a beginning, because time itself started at the Big Bang. I certainly don't think Joe Rogan and Wes Huff are the ones that are going to be able to steer us closer to the truth on this question. I would definitely listen to scientists before I would listen to them.
I don't know the theory either way about dark matter and the expansion of the universe. It's probably somewhat speculative because all those theories, there's a lot of different views on all of that stuff. It seems like science, because again, like it's questions that we don't really know the answers to. But that doesn't mean that I would take some assemblage of texts that were written from a certain place in the world at a certain historical time to be the immutable guide to the universe and conceptualize some personal God based on the reception of those texts throughout a 2,000-year history. That's just a whole nother assumption. If you want to say something caused the universe, I would have less of a problem with that. But it's just if you give it some sort of intentionality beyond just that initial creation, that's further than I would be willing to go. You can say, oh, something created, something was the first uncaused cause. Even though I think you and I both say there's stuff that people are studying with quantum mechanics that even complicates that idea. But that's so far from saying that there's like a personal deity like Christianity teaches.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that you could get somebody to some sort of deism with the idea that, look at the complexity of the universe, how did anything come from nothing? But Christianity has a whole mythology of claims that don't work out. So they were talking about turning water into wine. There's really no evidence of that. There's evidence of a universe. So we know something happened. We can look back through time by staring through the James Webb Telescope and try to get to the edge of what is viewable, and so make some assumptions about, okay, well, we can see everything is spreading out away from each other, which means there was some sort of an event that is propelling things all in opposite directions. the expansion of the universe. And then you can look at redshift and you can check out the speed. Is that accelerating or is that slowing down? Turns out it's accelerating. And then how do you explain that? Well, they try to explain that using, I think it's dark energy. And it's difficult to figure it out. But turning water into wine, it's just a claim like any other human throughout history has made as a claim. I think they're two very different things.
Yeah, I think Dionysus does something even similar to turning water to wine. The other interesting thing is we don't even have that story until the fourth gospel that we get, the latest gospel, John, where we finally get the story of Jesus. People just assume, well, like Jesus did this miracle. Well, not in Mark and not in Matthew and not in Luke. He did it in John. And that's a gospel that has its own problems with its historicity. Even scholars who are Christians will say John seems to be embellishing his stories here and using like stories to tell metaphor. But starting with this assumption that the universe starting was a miraculous event because it was so crazy and it came and expanded out this crazy cosmos that we have now, which again is looking at it the wrong way because these are all just contingent events that happen. The universe starts, there's no guarantee that it's going to form into the universe that we have now. It's totally dependent on 1,000 different things going wrong throughout time to get us to the universe that we're in now. Different species have to all die off, asteroids have to hit planets, there has to be time periods where almost no life can grow on the Earth, except for microscopic life. Times where the planet is just almost like nightmarish in its conditions for like millions of years, just to get us to the place where we are now.
I think there's something kind of insulting about these are fascinating questions that deserve all kinds of attention and speculation and scientific effort. And you have scientists in every branch of science trying to get to the bottom of some of these very deep questions, like the beginning of time, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of life on Earth, light, quantum physics, all these things that are super fascinating. And science admittedly will say, we don't understand this. That's why we're doing the science. That's why we're doing the research, because we don't fully understand it. And I think there's something insulting about apologists coming in and saying, aha, you don't understand something. So let me just pour in these, these myths and stories that I've believed my whole life without any real evidence or any good evidence. And I'm just going to say, you must be wrong because you haven't figured it out. So you should just believe what I'm saying. And I think there's something kind of insulting about that.
Or to use that like, wow, that's an amazing event. And because that event happened, you can believe the other miracles that are in the Bible, like Jesus turning water into wine. That doesn't follow.
You could say that with any supernatural claim.
We said before, too, if you look at the actual Hebrew, there never is a creation ex nihilo. There's never a creation from nothing. In Genesis 1, God creates out of the water, and in Genesis 2, he creates out of the arid ground. So there was already stuff there that God was using for his creation.
Well, they would talk about how in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. They would say, okay, so that was created from nothing.
Yeah, it says, in the beginning, when God created the heaven and earth, he was hovering over the chaotic waters. Well, that's the real Hebrew is saying, when God began creating the earth, he was hovering above the waters.
A better way to interpret it is to say, the water was here, but it was just chaos, and then God brought order to it.
Yeah, God's spirit was hovering over the waters, and then God was like, I'm going to start creating, and so out of the waters he starts drawing like the sun and the moon or whatever. I guess the land first.
Yeah, but I think they would cite as just Genesis 1:1. So in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So they would say, okay, so there was nothing, and then God created it, boom. And then he said, let there be light. But then you're right, because it says the earth was without form and void and darkness. I think the way it's actually interpreted is the creation process started when the earth was without form.
Yeah, in the Hebrew, it's much more clear that that's what's happening. And a lot of scholars have written on that, and it's basically that standard view. If you took a class in the Hebrew Bible, if you watched like Christine Hayes' Yale lectures on the Hebrew Bible in Genesis, she'll talk about that. It's not creation out of nothing. That's a later idea that gets imposed on the text by Christianity. What the Hebrew literally says is the text is saying, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth.
And you do see when the Big Bang is first hypothesized that there are individuals who are uncomfortable with that sounding like in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Because before that, the idea was that the universe was eternal. Yeah. And if you propose a point in time where everything starts to exist, well, you see some of these people are pushing back on it. They say things like, well, that sounds too religious. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a beginning point in time. Right. And at that point, if there's a Big Bang, you have to figure out, okay, well, what's the Big Banger? Right. And I mean, that's ultimately it's a metaphysical religious question. How did that thing get kicked off?
Brian Cox was explaining to us that there was an actual environment that existed pre the Big Bang. Don't they call it the environment? Is that what the term of it is?
Is this like Lawrence Krauss having a definition for nothing?
I don't know.
It's not nothing?
I don't know. It was just like, what are you even saying? You know, and then there's Sir Roger Penrose, who thinks there's a series of these things that happen. And that it's just this constant birth of universes and death of universes and birth of new universes. And it's like Big Bang, expansion, heat death, contraction, Big Bang. But we're almost like, that's too much. I can kind of wrap my head around 14 billion years. I can't wrap my head around eternity.
In theology, it's often described as the difference between understanding and comprehension, which my wife tells me are synonyms, and that's nonsense. But the idea is like, you can understand eternity as a long point in time. Right. You can't comprehend it.
It's like numbers. Yeah. You can understand how many zeros are in 14 billion years.
How much water's in the ocean.
Right.
I can comprehend, like, it's like, that's a lot of water. Yeah. But when you start talking about, like, tens of thousands of gallons, I'm like, lost me.
Yeah, I don't really know what that looks like. I kind of do. My brain's not set up for that. Yeah. Which is part of the weird thing about people. So our brain is clearly set up differently than every other creature that exists. You know, and if evolution is the only thing that created us, it's just evolution. How the fuck did we get so far ahead of everybody else? Yeah. I mean, not even just, and we're the doughiest, like weakest, softest, but also the smartest. Like, we gave up that. That was the trade-off. And somehow or another, by evolving into this particular form, we figured out a way to uniquely change the environment in ways that no other creature has even come close to.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that there are certain things that we think of in terms of like unexplained phenomena that we'll accept because we have some sort of a scientific definition of what this unexplained phenomena is, like the Big Bang. I mean, and you can say that there's theories. It's not completely unexplained. They kind of get it, but you kind of don't. Something that's smaller than the head of a pin that becomes the entire universe that we say is pretty fucking crazy. Yeah. You know, and just to say that just happened, and you don't really, I know you don't want to say you don't know, but you really don't know. There's no way you can know. It's not really possible to know. There's no like working theory where you can convince me that the whole universe gets compressed into something smaller than the head of a pin and then instantaneously becomes everything.
Yeah, it just gets back to what we were saying before. But what's the alternative? I agree that that's a fascinating question that science is working to get an answer to. But what's the answer that someone like Wes Huff is going to come in with and just say, God did it? To anybody, is that really a satisfying answer? Because wouldn't you naturally have the question, okay, now you have this eternal being that had no beginning? Where did that being come from? You're left with the exact same question. I don't think theism gets you any closer to answering that very deep question. It's just brings up the exact same question again.
You said it before, too. Wes Huff is kind of sidestepping all of the problems in the Christian, the account in Genesis itself, because he's not saying, well, Joe, I don't believe in evolution. So when you're saying human beings evolved a certain way and we survived, I think Adam and Eve were created in a garden and were deceived by a snake. And then they were banished, and their children somehow found wives and populated the earth, and then there was a flood, and, he did say some of that earlier. But what he's really doing is just kind of nodding his head while Joe asks these theoretical questions. I agree with you. The gap doesn't mean that you fill the gap with, some sort of ideological story.
Yeah, because you still have to explain that.
The Skeptics Bible Project is a John and Ben production, with intro music by John Lobker. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Skeptics Bible Project, and follow us on all social media platforms at Skeptics Project. Got questions or comments? Email us at skepticsbibleproject@gmail.com.
Oh